The Nintendo Switch 2 is a disappointment because when this thing comes out, I won't have any free time to do anything else I want to do. I won't be able to plan out my bookstore business. I won't be able to write new books. I won't be able to work. I won't be able to do anything. I won't be able to go on dates. I won't be able to go outside. I won't be able to, like, exercise and work out because I am going to be sitting here playing Mario Kart World and just enjoying it, enjoying this console, reveling in all of its features and everything it can do for me. Nintendo Switch online play, game chat, the new features, the new Joy Cons. The Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be a huge thing for me personally and for hundreds of millions of people across the world. It is going to be a phenomenon. And I think people are still coping and seething about this console. They have no idea how this thing is going to come out. They really are desperate to, like, pretend that Mario Kart World is going to fail, that Nintendo Switch 2 is going to underperform, and that Nintendo will leave the console space. And that is simply not going to happen. Like, the obsessive cultural hatred of Nintendo that has permeated the industry since, like, the 90s is dying and has been for a long time. But with every passing year, it feels like it becomes more and more mainstream to like Nintendo, to respect Nintendo, to want to see them do well, to be excited about their, like, upcoming products and stuff like that. Like, just seeing how mainstream the Switch 2 actually is should be a massive sign for everyone in the space as to just how big Nintendo actually is. Like, you keep seeing people, like, repeat, like, old, like, conspiracies from the 90s or whatever, like, oh, Mario is stale and derivative. Nintendo's only for kids. The hardware is underpowered. Now, none of that is actually true, but the copes are still persisting in spite of that. So, as more and more people begin to understand that the copes are just seething, right? That it's just a lie. Their entire arguments are going to collapse like a stack of cards. People are going to ignore their gaming PCs to play exclusively on Nintendo Switch 2, and it is going to be a phenomenal experience. People. The reason you don't really see people make fun of Xbox or PlayStation is because these brands are so irrelevant. When a console is like, the Steam Deck or the Ouya, you don't really see a lot of people really talking about them and acknowledging why they failed. It's not really a common thing for niche, underperforming products to have people seething about them near constantly. And that's the reality of the Switch 2, is that so many people came out and tried to say the Nintendo Switch 2 failed, that it was going to fail, that it was doomed to failure, that, like, nobody would want a successor to the Nintendo Switch, which is the most popular video game console of all time. Nobody wanted nobody the narrative that Nintendo was doomed to fail was, funnily enough, in and of itself, always doomed to fail, because you can't simply sit there and predict Nintendo's failure and, like, departure from the console industry for decades and then continue to just prolong it, like every year, like, oh, like Pokemon came out this year, so Nintendo's going to survive like another 6 months. It's like you're completely out of touch with reality. You're out of touch with the business, you're out of touch with the industry, you're out of touch with, like, the company, the competition. Like, you don't know anything. And this is becoming more and more prevalent every time the we see a major Nintendo release, because we see a lot of coping and seething about major upcoming Nintendo products. We see a lot of coping and seething about Nintendo Switch 2, the console, the platform, its durability, its sales numbers. Like, we see a lot of coping and seething about that. We're seeing a lot of coping and seething about Mario Kart World. Seeing people saying it's going to underperform compared to Grand Theft Auto 6, which, by the way, isn't even coming out this year anymore. That Mario Kart World is not a primary video game franchise, that nobody really cares about it, that it's gonna fail, and that simply isn't true. And you have people like, you know complaining about the release schedule. Like people are saying that like, oh, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to play old games. Bonanza doesn't look impressive. Like, we saw that during like the Bearman video, actually. That really infamous one that Donkey parodied. Like, oh, like Donkey Kong Bonanza, that doesn't look like a next gen game. It's like it's such an obvious cope. There's such a huge difference between something like Donkey Kong Bonanza versus against something like Knack or Astrobot. Like Bonanza like is an example of just how far ahead Nintendo is compared to the rest of the industry. Right? That is a very, very good example as to how much Nintendo has developed and grown over the past decade. The narrative that we all grew up with, that Nintendo just puts out the same games over and over again, that pretty clearly isn't true. Bonanza is a completely different game from Mario Odyssey. It features a completely different protagonist. It has like a completely different setting, themes, ideas, mechanics. Like that's really quite unlike anything else we've ever seen before. Not only in Nintendo titles, but with industry releases in general. Like, what exactly is lazy and derivative about Donkey Kong Bonanza? Nobody's been able to explain this. I remember when like the game was first announced, and there was some giant conspiracy that like, oh, it's just a rehash of Wario World on GameCube, which is like the stupidest like comparison you could possibly make. It doesn't even make any sense. They don't have anything in common other than like the beat 'em up mechanics. Like oh, but Wario also hunts treasure. It's like it's such a superficial like comparison that doesn't make any sense. Like anybody looking at this can tell you like this is a Donkey Kong game. This was designed to be a Donkey Kong game that developed the character further, that evolved the formula, that really pushed the bar, the envelope, right? This is a defining example of just how Nintendo has dominated the gaming industry. Like, um, again, like I've been saying this for a while, but I think people are really underestimating just how well Bonanza and Mario Kart World are going to do. Like, I do think that like people are underestimating just how well the third party ports are going to do. This is, I think, going to be the next major step when it comes to like the Nintendo community, is that like we are no longer in this position where we can reasonably expect never to get any of these major third party ports, because a lot of the big major releases in the past 5 years are launching on Switch 2 day one. And it's true that there are plenty of titles that did not come out on Switch 2, Doom the Dark Ages, for example. But considering the game's like lackluster performance, it probably should have. This is going to be, I think, like the trend when it comes to Switch 2, is that there are so many games coming to the platform that the occasional AAA release is not going to be able to drive sales for the competition. Something like Mario Kart World is going to dominate the sales charts over pretty much everything except Grand Theft Auto 6, which, first of all, is coming out next year, as I've mentioned already, but, it's also going to be competing with it, reasonably well. And unlike Rockstar, Nintendo doesn't have to rely on Mario Kart to drive sales. They have more things than just their Black Lives Matter simulator. Okay. So, with that being said, with that being like emphasized and expressed, like uh, Nintendo Switch 2 is not a disappointment. It is going to be another exceptional success story in a long line of Nintendo success stories. This is the next evolution of Nintendo Wii U.